Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's having a great day. This is Dan Tomaszewski with Everything MSP, and we are here for today's webinar, which is you can't patch people, but you can manage their risk. And as much as we would love to be able to, easily fix everything by a simple little patch of people, we know that can't be done. And it does come down to the human element. And we all know the truth that humans are now the biggest attack the biggest attack surface in cybersecurity. Sorry. um, your tools might be perfect, your stack might be all right, but one distracted click, just we're all so too quick to click, can mean a world of trouble. It's something that we all have to focus on. And today we're going to be digging in deeper. We're going to be talking about so many areas of cybersecurity, and I'm going to go ahead and bring in my special guest, Ben Bernstein with Huntress. Let's go ahead and bring Ben in. There we go. There's Ben. How
Hey
you doing
Dan, how's it
today?
going?
I'm doing great. It's good to have you here. It's always good to chat with you. And how is life treating you these days?
Life is good. It's busy. This is always just a busy time of the year between all the personal travel and family stuff, around the holidays,
Yeah.
and then trying to close out work. So quite a packed travel schedule towards the end of the year. But as someone who enjoys travel, I don't really mind it at all.
Yeah, yeah, and the odd thing too is, like you think about different industries, you think about retail. We're coming up into the holiday season where retail is busy. They know, this is their crazy period of time, but it's also, any holiday is a crazy period for hackers. As far as seeing opportunity and looking for those opportunities to be able to attack when many of us are maybe on a holiday, right?
That's exactly right. When the senior SOC analysts, the senior security engineers are taking a well-deserved break. I wish these hackers were better people, but they're going to kick people when they're down or when they're a little bit understaffed. So it's
Yeah.
it's just another reason to be partnered up to make sure that you've got more of like that team coverage approach of having some sort of partner in the SOC or from a managed detection response perspective, because the bad guys, they don't make it easy for us.
No, no, and and let's talk about that. Let's jump right in. Let's talk about that human element, the human factor. Why are humans, us, each of us, considered that primary, attack surface, and even more the devices or networks? Why is that?
Yeah, I think one, I love that question. It's a little bit of a loaded question, but one of
Yeah,
the things that I like to think about is, for the last 10 years, we've been talking about our cloud transformations, right? Where the world has moved away from everything living on-prem, where you build a server for each purpose and you're going to run applications on your own network or host your own data center or colo. And as folks move to more of, the app-driven, SaaS-driven, um, operational cadence, I think what we're seeing is that instead of just having a strong focus on protecting your own endpoints, which are accessing the important critical assets, it's more about how do we protect the identities. So you think about like the users, the username and password that it gets used to log into these business critical applications. And what we know, what the bad guys have figured out is if they just break into some of these accounts, they get access to just about everything. All of the financials and emails and critical business documents all get, they get tied back to usernames and passwords. So instead of just saying, hey, I've got, really good security on my laptops, desktops, and servers, we now have to take that same sort of proactive assumption of compromise approach to our identities. Because you're right, like all it's going to take is a user who's working a little bit too quickly. They're trying to get all their work done before it's the end of the week or before they're taking a break for the holidays. They're not trying to necessarily do something intentionally malicious, but
yeah,
sometimes it's just that, being a little bit too quick to click
yeah.
results in that world of hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. And and let's just face it, as humans, we want things that are easy for us. You know, two-factor is a pain, right? Other things are we like to use the same password over and over and over. And all the things that we do just to make life easier for us, obviously has is a great thing for those bad actors. And what are some thoughts in that area where we can shore things up, tighten things up, and just change our mindset around that we have to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to spend too much time today on password managers, but that's a great use case for what you just described, where people are reusing passwords or maybe
Yeah.
using insecure passwords, or maybe they're, God forbid, still writing it down on sticky notes and hiding it under their keyboards. I can tell you it's the first place someone's going to look if they get physical access to someone's
Right. Right.
office, right? But I think one of the things I'd love to kind of chat about today is like the human side about. I like the title of this webinar. You can't necessarily patch humans, but we can train them. And that's where if we provide security awareness training, and it's beyond just the, hey, can you recognize a phishing email?
Yeah.
But all the other like human behaviors that ultimately, our team members need to be enabled on in order to have best security hygiene, good practices as they're going to execute on their mission. And then the other side of that is, we can't expect every single user to be perfect. And that's where we need the stopgap of having that continuous monitoring. And that's where an identity threat detection and response solution comes in. So those are probably the two areas I'd love to chat about most today.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely want to throw out the password manager is definitely a good best practice when it comes to mitigating some of that human risk.
Yeah, and and in that regard, let's talk a bit about security awareness training. Um, it's not something that's new, but I don't think everybody's totally embracing it. We live in a world where there are organizations that still do not have that in place as part of their onboarding process or their ongoing technology training, and the implications are pretty serious. So how do we address that? How do we, get organizations to understand the seriousness and how critical it is to have this in place?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the places I like to start is just a little bit of empathy that I don't care how fun your training is. I think there's a lot of people who do enjoy the Huntress, security awareness training, but like at the end of the day, most folks, they're not jazzed up and excited about it. There is a little bit of like, hey, we just need to do this. It's the reality of 2025, almost 2026 now. But I think there's different ways that companies approach security awareness training, and we have more of a philosophy that we think actually results in the outcomes that we're all trying to focus on. And that's what cybersecurity is all about, right? It's the actual outcomes that we're striving for, not just like the pretty bells and whistles and
Right.
bundles to get there. So the Huntress approach, and it's I guess an approach that I personally believe in, is that it's not good enough to just do like your annual training for 1 to 2 hours, and people don't pay attention, they get distracted. If they're doing it virtually, they're probably on other tabs focusing on other things. That's just generally not going to be a good experience for that end user. It's not going to actually have them remember the training, especially 3 months later. And so what we like to do instead is have very short but regular trainings offered. So we have what we call managed learning, where Huntress will come up with relevant topics, and we can get into how we pick those topics in a second. But
Yeah.
if we say, hey, Dan, for each month, spend 7 to 10 minutes, watch, these really short, like 2 to 3 minute videos, learn a little bit about what are the most recent threats that you need to be looking out for, answer a couple of quiz questions, and then move on with your life. If you're doing that once per month, it's regular enough that it stays top of mind, but it's not so involved and time taxing that you just feel like this is awful and you're putting it off, and you're
Yeah.
trying to get distracted with your phone or other things. So I think that's a big sort of differentiator between a lot of the other flavors of SAT in the world is
Yeah.
what is that cadence? And then also, which I'd love to pivot to in a second, is like, where are these trainings coming from?
Yeah, and before we jump into that, I think when you talk about those little chunks of information, it's very much like fitness. You go for a walk, that little walk, maybe once a day during lunch has a huge impact on your health. Same thing when it comes to security training and the better understanding of this these tools all in front of us, right? Whether it be, a smartphone, a tablet, your workstation, each of those, learning little bits about that help us, and they can protect us. And it doesn't have to be some long drawn out, training process. It can just be those little, golden nuggets at a time that
That
add up.
That's absolutely right. The other thing that we're very focused on is that our SAT is narrative driven. We have this ongoing story and recurring characters. So going way back to the caveman days where they would tell stories and draw pictures and bring back favorite characters, we do the same thing with our SAT, which helps at the end of the day to make sure users are remembering the things that they're trying to learn in Huntress SAT. The other nice thing that I would call out, because we're talking about a cadence that's little bit more frequent than like your annual training.
Yeah.
For the MSPs or the IT folks who are watching this and they're like, oh my gosh, how much time is this going to like cost me to like update and maintain and make sure users are getting their training out? I think another big differentiator is our approach. It's fully managed, meaning once you kind of opt into that managed learning plan, it's kind of set and forget. The users will just get their training once a month. And then the IT admins don't really need to do anything other than to make sure that, the automatic learner sync happens. So it ties back to like Microsoft 365 or Google. And then they just get to enjoy the fruits of that initial setup, which is, once again, a little bit different from some of the other flavors of SAT, where it requires ongoing management of campaigns and trainings and the follow-up to make sure that people have actually taken their training. So we really want to enable IT and security professionals to focus on all the other hard problems in security. And if we could own some of this administrative burden for you guys, if we can help to reinforce some of these really positive, cybersecurity awareness stories, that's really our goal.
So on that note, let's talk a little bit about where this training comes from, where the education comes from. I think a lot of times, like you mentioned, there are different flavors out there. It can just be theory, and not that that's a bad thing, but is it related specifically to what the end users are experiencing? Is this tied back to real life type scenarios? How do you approach that, and what is the best approach to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And phishing has become way more complex over the
Yeah.
years. So it's important that we're keeping up with it because, if we were having this conversation, 15 years ago, we'd say, oh, look out for the really poorly spelled email.
Right.
And it should be really easy to identify. In 2025, it's not the case where the threat actors are leveraging ChatGPT to carry out these attacks. They're really clever. They look really good. And it's more than just being able to recognize traditional phishing in your mailbox. So to answer your question, it comes from our SOC, our Security Operations Center. So in the same way, we're monitoring millions and millions of endpoints and millions of identities and surfacing threats every single day. The question that we then get to ask is, where are these threats coming from? What was the lure that the user fell for? Were there some cybersecurity hygiene best practices that, had they been adhered to, might have avoided this threat that we ultimately had to publish in an incident report? And so when you think about this, yes, we can teach about phishing, but how about things like ClickFix, those fake captchas that have been really hot in the threat actor world this past year? We can teach about things like typo squatting. So, when someone registers a website or a domain and they change just one character, I think there was a viral meme or something going around LinkedIn the past couple of weeks where someone changed it from Microsoft.com to lowercase rn, which if you look at it very quickly, looks like the lowercase m in Microsoft. And so being able to make sure users can look out for things like typo squatting or even things like SEO poisoning or malvertising, right? Where the bad guys are able to literally sign up for a Google Analytics account, pay to promote their website, probably using a stolen credit card that they got off the dark web. And they can promote things in that sponsored ads section when you do a Google search. We even actually had an episode about remote work, which I think is interesting because a lot of folks might be like, well, we don't allow our employees to work remotely. How does that apply? But then it's an opportunity to talk about, sure, But some folks might go on vacation and bring their phone, which is signed into their email, right? Or they might bring their laptop with them if they are going away for the holidays, and they're going to keep an eye on, just status quo. I think that's another opportunity to show like what other sort of like human behaviors outside of, hey, don't click on this, can we make sure users are being mindful of?
Yeah, I mean, we all essentially are remote workers these days, and
Yeah.
no matter what. I mean, nobody is, forcing that, but it's just part of our nature that we work and do stuff. We shift our time, and it might just be grabbing your cell phone and checking Teams or checking your email. Maybe you're logging in and you're pulling a file. Like all of that can have such an impact, and so work surrounds us, and I will say, when you mention the R and the N next to each other, that looks like the M. I follow Huntress on Facebook and on LinkedIn, and I saw you guys pointed that out. You showed the screenshots from that, and I thought that was clever. I mean, it was just like clever in a bad way, right? On the part of the bad actor, and we've all seen that, or even the letter L, in front of a domain name. We've seen that in real life with actual clients,
Yes.
where it's happened. And, I remember it's been several years, but I remember a scenario like that where a client actually sent 35 grand to somebody,
Yeah.
and it was because of a bad actor, engineered something that looked like it was coming internally. They bought a domain name that had that letter L in front of it, and they got taken. It happens.
Oh yeah, it happens. I wish I could say that's the first I've ever heard of that. But I mean,
Right, right.
that's like when you think about sort of like the outcomes of, if these bad threat actors are able to succeed, if you don't have the proper security awareness training or that backstop of that ITDR, that identity threat detection response solution, that's what it's going to result in like the fake wire transfer scams. We see a lot of like direct deposit scams as well. So imagine, if I take over your email, Dan, and I send an internal email basically saying, hey guys, we switched to a new bank to ensure no interruption for your paychecks at the end of the month. Send me your updated, routing number and account number. And folks will be like, I don't care what I'm working on. I need to make sure I'm getting paid. They're not pausing to think about like, is this expected?
Right.
Especially if it's coming from an internal email or a typo squatted email address that looks really, really similar. So I think those are the big scary things. And ultimately what they say is that, when you think about the most severe identity attacks, we're thinking about business email compromise, often abbreviated BEC. And these are like the potentially like business ending events. We used to think of ransomware as being like the end all be all as far as like what is the worst cyber incident that could possibly happen. What we're finding out now and what the threat actors have figured out is it's way easier to carry out identity attacks, and it's way more financially rewarding for these threat actors as well. The
Yeah.
last numbers I looked at, BECs result in 75 times more financial loss than ransomware does. How crazy is
Wow.
that?
That is crazy. And the interesting thing too is I was reading up on some of the psychology of these scenarios, not from the bad actor side, but more from an end user side. Excuse me, where there's situations where someone fell for a phishing attack and they had absolutely zero idea until something bad occurred, where all of a sudden they were, they didn't, even after it happened, they didn't, like say, well, you know what, that seemed a little fishy, I probably shouldn't have done it. They had no idea, because the sophistication of it, it got to a point where they were like, somebody had asked, did anything happen? Did you get any kind of email prompting you for this? No, not at all. And after thorough investigation, this article illustrated how it was found out that they did get something, but
Mhm.
in their mind, they didn't think they did anything, wrong. And, it just totally took them by surprise. So that is the scary thing. You're just doing your job, doing it by rote. And sometimes you got to break that pattern and you got to stop, take a step back and think, is this the right decision? Is this real?
Absolutely. That's exactly it. And the nice thing about SAT too is that we can send out simulated phishing on a monthly basis. So we can randomize throughout an organization different examples of real life, phishing lures. And
Yeah.
we can see, hey, are you able to recognize that this is not a legitimate email and mark it as phishing? Or if someone does click on it, we can, report on that. And the cool thing is that a lot of our phishing, our simulated phishing that we send out will have a landing page where it might look like a Microsoft login page, or it might look like a Google Workspace login page. And we can see, hey, are folks actually like putting in credentials? And we don't actually save like the credentials that they put in, but it shows the difference between a click, which got them to a bad page and could have presented them with downloads or other risky scenarios, or are they freely giving away credentials? And that once again helps us understand that human risk. Going back to like the title of this, ultimately we need to make sure our humans, which are an incredibly important asset, are safeguarding information. They're safeguarding the assets. And in the same way, it's important to have good locks and a good, physical security system to make sure no one's physically breaking into your office. But you also have to make sure that you've got the right safeguards around your humans so that they're not willingly allowing the threat actors in just by clicking a little bit too quickly.
Yeah. I'd like to shift gears a little bit. When we take a look at our discussion today is that you can't patch people, but you can manage their risk. It is a critical thing that we need to focus on. One other area that comes into play here is going to be ITDR, identity threat detection and response, and the importance of that. So let's just kind of shift gears from this perspective and talk a little bit about how what problem that's trying to be solved that traditional EDR, MFA, isn't necessarily going to address, and how we need to take it a step further.
Yeah. So in the same way with EDR, we want to catch things really early in that attack chain. We see that something got dropped and executed on the endpoint. We want to catch it right away. We don't want that threat actor to be hanging out, potentially having interactive access, opening up reverse shells, sending more instructions from their command and control server. It's the same thing in the identity space. We want to catch them as early in that attack chain as possible. And I think there's probably a lot of folks who are watching this and they're like, well, I've got MFA, I've got that multi-factor authentication. Right. So, no threat actor can log in because, I've got a good username and password. And even if they somehow grab that password off of the dark web, even if they somehow, use some sort of brute force or whatever to figure it out, they're like, well, the threat actor doesn't have my cell phone. So how on earth are they going to get in?
Right.
And the ultimate reality is it's not as much of a silver bullet as we once believed it was. There are ways to work around it. We know about like session token theft and ways that they can replay those session tokens to basically get around needing that legitimate MFA code. And so I guess just to kind of go back, like, how do we catch folks early in that? We can have that same sort of assumption of compromise, that 24/7 monitoring, all backed by our worldwide SOC. So in the same way we have humans investigating the interesting signals and events that happen on the endpoint, we can look at really interesting events. So we can look at, are we seeing suspicious logins? Are they coming in from a different location? Are we seeing that same session ID showing up more than once, but maybe with different artifacts like a VPN? Maybe they're showing up with a different browser or a different operating system than the user typically logs in with. All these different signs that, hey, this person who's logging in, they're showing signs that it may not be them actually logging in.
Yeah.
But we can go beyond that because we also know that bad guys are really tricky and they're trying to essentially get folks to authorize rogue or traitorware type of applications within their Microsoft 365 tenants. So instead of necessarily needing to break into someone's account who has a high level of access and permissions, you could just trick someone into authorizing an illegitimate version of an app that will get access for them. So it's not necessarily your traditional, hey, I've stolen passwords and I've logged in as them. That's another thing that Huntress can monitor for and help companies to revoke access. Other interesting things that we can think about too is going back to that unwanted access approach. I think there's always this idea that like impossible travel is another one of those end all be all ways of trying to identify when threat actors are coming in, because how could it be possible where if Ben is logging in from Texas right now and 1 minute later you see a login, from Russia, or you see a login from the UK? Surely that must be illegitimate. But in today's world where there could be legitimate reasons where you're logging to different locations. Maybe you've got an AWS VPC that's located in a different region. Maybe you have to provide remote support and log in with that same Microsoft 365 account. There are going to be legitimate reasons where you might need to log in different locations. But going back to what I said before around using other artifacts to tell a more perfect story, we can use what we know about that user and how they're typically logging in. What's their typical ISP? What is the typical browser that they're on? Their typical operating system. We can look for anomalies there. So if they're typically on a Windows desktop and they like to use Microsoft Edge, they're typically in Texas, but all of a sudden, yeah, we see the different location. But then we also are seeing, hey, they're using like an Express VPN, one of those consumer grade ones, not necessarily the VPN that's sanctioned by their business. That's going to be suspicious. Now that we see they're coming in from a Kali Linux box and they're using Firefox, these are all signs that this is probably not the actual end user. And we probably need to lock this down and send over a critical incident report. And that really gets into like the R of ITDR, which is like the response side.
So I just recently heard a story, and I hope I have all the details right here, but it was an MSP that had an issue with a client. The client was getting, like tons and tons of emails showing up in their junk mail folder, and they were all undeliverables. And they were showing up in all these undeliverables and showing up in the junk mail folder. And essentially what was happening is someone had, most likely it was one of those session token thefts, got access to their 365. They are, I don't remember what state, I think it was a Midwestern state, but this particular end user ended up being down in Florida on vacation. So it wasn't in their home state. However, it was identified through tools within 365 that these emails were being sent from Texas. Interesting, you mentioned Texas as that example, but they were being sent from Texas, and it was just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of messages that were being sent out. And and the MSP was like, the client kept going over and over. You keep telling me that MFA is going to keep us secure. So how in the world did this happen? How did somebody get into our account and access it and use that account to send all this spam out when MFA is in place, right? So those are the scenarios where it's not, like you said earlier, it's not that silver bullet, and it can still happen. But if there was additional layers of protection on there, identifying where these were coming from, that could have been flagged, right?
That's exactly right. The nice thing about Huntress too is, let's say we somehow missed the initial login. Maybe it was the threat actor was coming in from the United States and it wasn't all that suspicious from a login perspective. In your example, they're probably creating mail flow rules to automatically reroute emails to like the deleted folder or to one of these, like the RSS folders, another really common one. We also have that ability to look for what we call like shadow workflows, where the threat actors think that they're being really sneaky, trying to hide their tracks. So if they're sending out campaigns, they don't want users seeing folks replying to it being like, hey, I think you got hacked, dude. So we can identify some of these malicious mailbox rules, the shadow workflows. One of the newest pieces of functionality that we're coming out with right now is actually the ability to be able to identify and detect outbound phishing campaigns. So being able to see when an account's taken over and then they're trying to use that to then spread to other folks. And sometimes that's used to get other internal folks, maybe someone who has a higher level of access. Sometimes it's just trying to create a wider net of compromised accounts that they can then use for more of their continued spam campaigns. But that's just going to be another layer, and that's ultimately one of like the final steps in their campaign and effort is usually like outbound spam, and that's often happens after they've already exfilled data, looked through the SharePoints and the OneDrive for businesses, looked for juicy attachments, in your email. looked at the potential like invoices or company letterhead that they could then use for more targeted attacks. So it's definitely one of the other ways that Huntress wants to continue to be a real partner in the fight against identity-based cybercrime.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too, those early stage, identifying it at that early stage can have a huge impact. I'm sure it's all over the board. There's no, one way or another that bad actors do this, but would I be correct that some are taking that initial approach of seeing, how far they can get away with something, and then they full throttle it and take full advantage before jumping right in full throttle? Would that be correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting is we see like the full gamut. There's a huge spectrum
Yeah.
where in some cases it's really sophisticated, and they're trying to learn who did they break into, and they're trying to be surgical with how can we whale fish someone now that we've broken into just the intern's account. And we see
Yeah.
some that it's fully automated, it's programmatic, and it's a script that runs it. Essentially, it says, hey, once you've broken in and you've brute forced or you've stolen the session cookie, go ahead, create the mailbox rules, go ahead, then just start sending out all the spam. So we see a lot on either end of the spectrum and a bunch in between. It really just depends on who is the threat actor and what are they really trying to go after.
Yeah. What would be one of the biggest things that you would tell an MSP today when it comes to ITDR that doesn't have anything in place? What are, I think we covered a lot of the reasons here, but what is the one thing that you would say they should be focused on in helping to protect those clients from that perspective?
Yeah. So, back in the day, when we talked about cybersecurity, we kind of had this evolution, right? It was, hey, make sure you have a perimeter firewall and an AV. And then we were like, you know what? You got to have an EDR. It's basically table stakes. And I think we're now at the point where ITDR is table stakes. Whether it's with Huntress, which of course we'd love to see, or whether it's with somebody else, you have to make sure you've got someone watching your back. And going back to what I explained before, it's not like tinfoil hat. This isn't a sales pitch. The reality is the majority of the threats that we see and the majority of the threats in the world are going to be targeting the identities. So it's really important to have that protective layer. We've talked about how you can use SAT on the front end to help enable your people to reduce the risk of them actually clicking on stuff, but you still need to have that backstop to be able to identify attacks that are already in progress to shut them down before the really devastating stuff happens. So making sure that you've got some ITDR, ideally one that's fully managed. Everything that Huntress does is managed, which means it's backed by our SOC, by real human beings who can investigate. It's not AI, it's not snake oil where you're hoping that the AI isn't going to hallucinate, right? It's real humans, real experts who can see this looks weird. Doesn't mean they can't use AI or some sort of like co-pilot to assist in gathering relevant information. But you want humans to say, this does not look right, and we need to lock this down, because it's not just enough to identify it. Like, how do you actually stop these attacks that are in progress? So another thing that like what we can do, really focusing on that R in identity threat detection and response, is when you respond, you need to lock accounts. You need to revoke all active sessions, making sure that the threat actor is kicked out, start from a clean state. And one of the historical challenges with isolation or locking accounts in the Microsoft 365 world is there are so many folks who are watching this and they're like, well, we've got a hybrid Active Directory setup, meaning they have some sort of local domain controller that's just going to overwrite whatever command you instruct. If you lock an account in Entra, AD is just going to overwrite it. And so one of the cool things that part of like the Huntress platform is we can actually instruct that local domain controller to keep the account locked. So it's not fighting back and forth. We don't have to keep trying to lock that account over and over. We can ensure that bad guys are going to get kicked out and stay out until we can clean things up and bring business back to normal.
And you have that ability to be able to isolate individual workstations or all, right? I mean, you can pinpoint where the threats are.
That's right. Yeah. So we can identify threats just through like the Office 365 and Entra ID stream of logs and be able to lock down identities. Or to your point, if it's starting on an endpoint and we're seeing endpoint related anomalous activity, we can isolate just that one endpoint. If we see, hey, maybe there's ransomware, maybe there's interactive access and lateral movement, and we need to lock down the entire environment, we do have, that big red button to be able to mass
Yeah.
isolate an entire organization.
Right. And when you do lock it down, obviously it restricts that end user, it restricts the bad actors from being able to do anything. However, am I correct that you still have access to that machine, you
We
being
do.
Huntress?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. So one of the nice things about isolation is it's going to essentially say, hey, computer, if we're talking about an endpoint, it's going to essentially say you can't talk to anyone else on the same network. You can't call home back to that C2, that command and control server that
Right.
the threat actor is controlling, or anywhere on the internet, except for Huntress. Now, we do give our partners the opportunity to allow list some of their own tooling, like a Screen Connect instance or their RMM. So if the IT personnel need to be able to get access and do some additional investigative work, in addition to what Huntress is already doing for them, we give folks that option. But ultimately, we really want to restrict what is allowed to communicate with this infected endpoint. And if Huntress can take that burden off of our IT and security partners to say, hey, we will investigate, we will figure out what's happening, we will send the commands to look through, the event logs and the browser history and figure out what actually transpired, so that we have a really good sense of like, okay, we've contained it. We've now called out all the things that were changed or done by the threat actor. And we have a good set of remediation instructions to make sure that when we are ready to de-isolate or cancel that network quarantine, we feel confident that all of these malicious artifacts have been totally cleaned up.
And that can happen at any point. I mean, it doesn't matter, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you have that capability to self isolate. And so, I mean, I think the power there, especially for an MSP that, may not have operations running 24 hours a day, is that they can still have an impact and control over that.
Absolutely. And I think another great consideration, I like your example, especially if it's the middle of the night. One, I think a lot of us, who are watching this, they're like, well, I have to sleep at some point. And I know security
Right.
is hard and you want to look at all of the alerts, but having that human team to watch your back and action these threats, to contain them, to clean up the artifacts, and basically make sure that you feel good about being able to resume business and say, yep, Huntress cleaned up all the things. And maybe they just want us to reset a password or do a final reboot of the computer
Right.
before bringing it back online. You don't have to look at it until 8 a.m. the next day. That's pretty awesome. And
Yeah.
the other cool thing, like when you think about who is responding at 2 a.m., there's a lot of even outsourced MDR companies or SOC as a service companies where it's just an on-call person who's trying to wake up at 2 a.m. and they're trying to slam a Red Bull and they're wiping their bleary eyes. They're like, what is this alert? What's the
Right.
company? What's actually happening? The Huntress approach, where we have folks around the world, a follow the sun approach, where we start in America, we've got folks in Australia, we have folks in the UK and in Europe. We can make sure that it's always someone who is working normal hours on a normal shift, ready to be there for you. And we have a dedicated SOC support team ready to help answer questions. Should you need a little bit more context? Maybe we need a little bit more information. We've got folks that are totally dedicated to being that customer-facing function at Huntress to make sure our partners feel really confident about the scenarios that they find themselves in or their end clients find themselves in. And we'll be there to even liaise and help out if you are bringing in an incident response firm. We can make sure that they get logs, right? And so making sure that who's going to be helping you out and investigating alerts in the middle of the night is another huge differentiator, and a question you should be asking yourselves or your current security partners of, who is responding and how do I get support late at night?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'll just reiterate, the power of that is just tremendous as far as being able to, isolate that device, the ability to still have control of the device for that remediation, because, we all have clients that may be remote. They might be anywhere in the country, around the world, and the ability to, have impact on that without, well, number one, a truck roll, but being able to get them back up and running as quick as possible. and as quick, efficient, and secure as possible, and getting them back to where they need to be, and being able to operate is just critical. So, so as we wrap up here, any additional points of advice that you'd like to give to MSPs today?
I think the biggest thing that I'd leave folks with is just making sure that you've really got that layered approach to security, the defense in depth. And I know that's not necessarily like a new or novel concept, but when you pair the Huntress SAT or any effective security awareness training platform with regular training, a story-driven narrative, with the ongoing monitoring of an ITDR solution, especially one that's backed by real humans in a 24/7 SOC, like that's going to be a really good place to start. I always like complementing things with things like conditional access policies, complementing it with that password manager that we talked about at the top of the call. These are all really solid layers of protection. And we're hoping that if you put in enough preventative layers and then that continuous monitoring layer as your backstop, you're in a great position to ward off a lot of that phishing, a lot of these attacks. And if something does unfortunately get through, you're in a really good position to stop them early and often.
Excellent. And for any of our listeners that might not be familiar with Huntress, of course, you can check out more at huntress.com. But you also have a neighborhood watch program that's available for MSPs. Can you share a little bit more detail about that program?
Yeah, so the Neighborhood Watch program, it is totally free for all MSPs, so that you guys can trial it out. It's like a free POC, if you will, where you get a real feel of what is it like to work alongside Huntress, where you guys are welcome to roll out our EDR, our ITDR, our security awareness training, our managed SIM, and you can get a sense of like, what will Huntress get visibility into? How can they detect things? How do they respond? What is it like if I need to call in and work with SOC support or send in a ticket? We have a great reputation for a reason. If you don't believe me, try it out yourself. There's really no consequence to spinning up some neighborhood watch licensing. I promise you, our salespeople are not going to be overly aggressive. We want to do this because we believe in the MSP community. We've always been channel first and partner first. And if you have questions, we'll be able to help you out. This is more than just our 4 products today. We want you guys to be in a great position to stay secure, to help your clients have a great security posture. And that's why we've had this neighborhood watch program since like the early days of Huntress.
Awesome. Ben, I want to thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate all of your knowledge and sharing that with our community. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Dan. And if we don't get a chance to chat before then, I just want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving, happy, safe holidays. And thanks so much, as always, for bringing me on. I always enjoy our discussions.
You too. I appreciate it. All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and we will talk to you soon. Take care.